Welcome to the DRF Sports Podcast, brought to you by DRF Sports. America's most trusted name in horse racing is now providing sports bettors with exclusive data, analytics, previews, videos, and expert picks on all major sports. Bet smarter and have more fun doing it. It's the DRF Sports Podcast, and now your host, Sheldon Alexander. Ready, set, bet.
This is the DRF Sports Podcast, episode 33. Make sure you like and follow wherever you get your podcast. I'm your host, Sheldon Alexander, and it was another wild week of football that isn't even really over yet, as there's two Tuesday night games, but we're fresh off of a doubleheader on Monday night, and we should have gone 2-0. Let's be serious. But I have no idea what the Bears are doing. I have no idea how they weren't able to cover that. All I can say is that was art. How they were unable to cover 7.5 points, just finding new and different ways to not score in the red zone. Only the Chicago Bears could do that. More on that in a sec, for sure. But first off, have you checked out Cash Grab? Cash Grab is DRF Sports' all-new free-to-play sports prediction game where you can win real money. It's available to every sports fan in the App Store and the Google Play Store. Win real cash prizes every day, as well as a chance to win big money jackpots. All you have to do is download the free DRF Cash Grab app, create an account, start predicting who will win the first quarter, how many touchdowns will George Kittle score. Answering questions like these can end in you making real money. Maybe you should start betting on how many touchdowns will Deebo Samuel score, but hey, story for another day. Either way, download the DRF Cash Grab app now and win big. And hopefully you can win some cash here as well, as we do this podcast twice a week. On Tuesdays, we recap the week that was, and on Fridays, it's the Picks Pod. And today, we're recapping the week that was, but we also got more picks coming to you for sure. Lots of football to talk about, including the Detroit Lions coming up big, some crazy games. But first, something else that you need to make sure that you stick to is the DRF Sports Sunday Scoop e-newsletter. If you haven't done so already, make sure you sign up for free at drf.com/sports to receive 2 free weekly newsletters delivered to your email inbox every Friday and Sunday. Both are packed with powerful betting angles you don't want to miss. Again, drf.com/sports for all the insight and analysis you need each and every day. Plus, of course, we go in depth on this podcast. As mentioned on today's episode, we're still recapping the week that was. We're hitting you with some midweek picks. So much to break down, so much to talk about, including the ending of that wild Bears game. So, of course, got Matt Russell. He's coming through. And luckily for y'all, he starts right about now. The holiday season is officially here, and the NFL is a gift that just keeps on giving, isn't it? The games just don't seem to stop, and neither do we here on the DRF Sports Podcast. And of course, my guy, Matt Russell, joins us. And right off the bat, I'm jumping right into it because I'm still fired up. I got to ask about the end of that Bears-Vikings game because I don't recall, and I'm sure there's something like this that has happened before, but I feel like it might have been on a game-winning touchdown with no time left on the clock. But just to run things down in case people missed it, which if you're listening to this pod, I don't know how you would have missed it, but for the lames, here we go. The Vikings spread was essentially 7.5, let's say.
Yeah.
And the Bears are driving. And first off, I have no idea how the Bears didn't cover this game easily, but of course, it just ends perfectly, right? Bears are driving down the field. They score a touchdown with 0 time left on the clock. Now, the first official who's right there says no touchdown for some reason. I have no idea why, but then you can see on the replay, obviously it's a touchdown. Somehow, someone, I need you to explain to me, doesn't call this a touchdown, but then they don't allow for the extra point to be kicked. I don't know whose decision that is. I don't know how that happens because the broadcast still don't acknowledge why the majority of us are still watching this trash game at like midnight, right? So the broadcast doesn't explain it. And all of a sudden you're just like, you know what? We're not going to kick this extra point. So the game ends 17-9.
Yeah.
when the only reason anyone's really watching that game, unless you are a loser Bears fan or a loser Vikings fan, is because you got some money going on this game, right?
Yeah.
And 17-9, meaning the Vikings cover, no extra point kicked. How did this happen? Why did this happen? How is this part of the rules? I'm so confused. Can you help me out, my dude?
Yeah. And so ironically, of course, it actually stems back to a famous Vikings game, the playoffs, 3 years ago, the Minneapolis Miracle. Obviously, the Minneapolis Miracle happens. The Vikings win the game on that insane Stephon Diggs touchdown. Everybody goes running around. Diggs, the helmet goes. Everybody walks off the field, and the Vikings win. And then they go, yeah, but we got to kick the extra point, everybody. Hey, guys, come on back. We got to go through this extra point thing. And the Vikings are like, we don't even want to. Like, we're already partying. Like, Stephon Diggs is already knee deep in a bottle of champagne. And they're like, no, man, sorry, we got to bring him back out here. And so everybody sort of trudges their way out there. And they don't even kick the extra point because, again, why would you? They just kneel it out. So whether it's a 1-point victory, a 4-point victory, an 8-point loss, they decided after that, unless it is fundamental to the game result, we don't kick the extra point when the zeros are on the clock. Now, I think, again, ironically, and this one's, I don't remember this one quite as well, but I think it was the playoffs last year where the Bears were at New Orleans and they scored a late touchdown. I think it was Jimmy Graham or Cole Kmet. I can't figure out which one's which at this point. One of those two guys scored a late touchdown, and that was it. Right. And it wasn't, I don't think it necessarily mattered to the spread. I think it actually got them inside of the teaser number that day. Okay. And so everybody was kind of fine with it. Nobody was really bothered by it. Right. And so it's funny how these things do happen and they do sort of, the rule does come into play. It's just, unless the point spread is involved, none of us really have an issue with it. And so, I saw you were on +7.5, man, and you did everything right. And that's the stuff that we talk about with the last couple of weeks and where the last couple of weeks have gone awry. And this week we did okay. We ended up having a winning week. And so, okay, great. We're sort of back on the horse, if you will, but you still have these games. Now, we talked on Friday morning about this game, and I was like, well, fundamentally what happened in this game from a point spread standpoint was opens 3.5 for the Vikings, right? And I'm like, well, my number actually was 4 for that game, if everybody was okay, everybody was healthy, et cetera, but I fundamentally was never going to bet on the Vikings in this spot. So I knew that I liked the Bears, and we talked about that, right? But of course, given everything that was going on, we certainly weren't going to make that bet on Friday morning, as that line had moved up to 4.5, 5, because of some, coaching positives and the odd positive here or there. And so it was sort of working out perfectly the way that we'd want it to, is where Monday would roll around and all of a sudden it was 7. And you had the patience of anyone here, waiting and grabbing 7.5. I jumped the gun with a couple hours before the game started, and I was just like, fine, I'll take the +7. I don't want this to go back to 6.5. When people realize that these cluster injuries, in this case for the Bears, didn't really matter all that much, right? And again, we've talked about this over and over and over again, whether it's, widespread injuries to the Cardinals. I mean, just pick your team at this point. I mean, it's certainly the case for the Browns as well yesterday. We can talk about that game too. But these injuries to literally not the top echelon of players on a team. And even when they do, they're usually over exaggerated, right? We had obviously the Cardinals without Kyler Murray adventure throughout the middle of the season. Just waiting and allowing the lines to just slightly, in some cases, overreact for themselves is the strategy this season. It will be the strategy next season. It is probably the strategy for all seasons, because honestly, not that many people really matter that much to the point spread. And the ones that do matter much to the point spread are often given too much credit against the point spread, right? And so the thing is, you waited and you did great as far as when you came in, what your market entry point was. And I felt like so did I. And then we go and we watch the game, because if the handicap for why we wanted to grab the Bears as late as we did was, we don't think that Kirk Cousins is going to take advantage of whomever is out there in the secondary, then we were right. we were bang on, right? Like this guy, and it was the same thing against the Steelers, where they take this huge lead because Dalvin Cook is running through the secondary like a Swiss boy through a meadow, and we're just sitting there going like, Kirk Cousins not doing it. Like, and it's stupid to sort of handicap something by like, well, Kirk Cousins at prime time, or right, or like Tom Brady's bedtime or whatever, but like, how many times they flash up that Kirk Cousins is like won 3 out of his last 4 primetime games, but you're just like, I don't know what the other 2 were before these last 2, but this wasn't Kirk Cousins, and it wasn't Kirk Cousins last Thursday either. And so, you kind of nailed it as far as like market entry point, the handicap of why you would bet this team, because the inflation of the point spread is too much. Like, all of these things you were correct on. And even if we decided like, oh man, like the Bears though, right? Like it's the Bears, it's Nagy, like all of those things, like that's why the point spread exists, right? Like the sportsbook is aware, and the market is aware that Matt Nagy is a stooge, and they are aware that the Bears are going to bear. But like the Bears are out there going up and down the field on the Vikings, right?
So easy.
It's so painfully easy in a lot of ways, because they get into the red zone and then something happens and it all just kind of falls apart, whether it's a fumble, of which were there 2, 3 of them, something along those lines, and 4th down. And like the irony in all of this thing, right, is that they fail 2 times in the last 8 or so minutes inside the red zone on 4th down. And again, I'm not advocating for this. I'm just saying like it's humorous, because if they had kicked 2 field goals in that situation, which would have been objectively the wrong thing to do given the circumstance, but at 4th and 6 and 4th and 9, we all just decided because they were down 14 that like, yeah, it was correct. Like you just kind of have to do it, kind of have to go, right? They would have been down 8 for that last drive. And then the last drive that gets a touchdown scored in it, we would have actually had to see them execute the 2-point conversion with 0 seconds on the clock, right? But for some reason, the hardos who were dying for field goals in the first drive and in the first half of the Chargers-Chiefs game on Thursday, for the hardos who were constantly dying for these field goals to be kicked, which somehow we went from a space where we didn't want anybody kicking field goals because we know that that's a lame way to try to win a game, to now everybody's dying to kick field goals. Nobody was against it when Matt Nagy was going for stuff on 4th and 8 and 4th and 9. And I'm not saying that it was the wrong thing. It's just the irony of it all, where if he actually had kicked those field goals, they would have been in a lot better spot, and certainly would have, you never know for sure, and all that sort of thing, because of, game path and et cetera, et cetera. But like, it's just kind of hilarious that like we just finished, and we didn't finish the week because we still got 2 more games here, but we finished Monday night. We finished Monday Night Football with like, oh man, if they had just kicked a bunch of field goals along the way, like we would be in such better shape in all of this game. So, I mean, you're absolutely on the right side with the Bears out there. And for me, I mean, I got around to Monday and we talked about it as, conceptually sort of a best bet. But like by the time Monday rolls around, I'm like, I'm just going to put like a regular bet down on this, because all of these guys are out in the secondary for the Bears. And it is worth mentioning as we sort of move on to everything else that happened this weekend. Think about it from a positional standpoint, right? It's the scarcity concept of a position when we're dealing with cluster injuries going forward, right? So it's common knowledge that running backs are replaceable, right? Because physically, from a stature standpoint, like you don't have to be, genetically special, right, to be a running back. There are a lot of guys out there who are about 6 feet tall, rocked up, pretty fast, like those guys in theory grow on trees. We had some guy named Craig Reynolds run for 100 yards for the Lions this past weekend. Defensively, you see, it's funny. Akeem Nicks comes back. He's all over the field, just absolutely running over us, because dudes who look like Akeem Hicks don't just grow on trees. Right. Same thing with a Roquan Smith. Right. You don't just walk down and go to the Walmart and see a guy who looks like that, who has those physical characteristics. Defensive backs kind of grow on trees, right? What are the characteristics of a defensive back, right? Like, well, they don't have to be particularly tall. I mean, ideally they're fast, but we're not talking like track star, like top 1% of the universe type fast. And everybody talks about anybody anyway, even a good secondary, right? Like what's the cliche? Well, blah, 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 can't cover blah, blah, blah for 5 seconds, right? Like the defense, the front 7 has to get to the quarterback. They have to pressure quarterback because no cornerback can cover, Justin Jefferson for 5 seconds. Well, no cornerback can cover Justin Jefferson for 5 seconds. Like, why do they matter all that much, right? Like if a lot of the defense is happening with the front seven, like I can kind of put a bunch of different guys back there. And if the pressure is on, they're going to be able to do enough. And these guys aren't off the street necessarily, right? They're in practice squads all over the league because these guys also play special teams, these guys of this type of characteristic, right? And watch college football. Like it's just loaded with like 5-10 guys who have a decent amount of speed, right? You don't need any particular ball skills. You don't have to have good hands because it's nice if you catch the occasional pass, for an interception, but it's not required by any means, right? So it's a very replaceable position. So it's different if it's a D line, an O line, right? Obviously a quarterback, etc. When we're talking about defensive backs, it's very replaceable. You can find guys, and if you have a scheme and if you have guys up front that can compensate for it, it's not that big of a deal. So again, just another one long line of games that you do everything right in the NFL, and for some reason, somehow, you just don't end up cashing. But everybody who was on the Bears last night definitely deserved better.
Yeah, it was. I tweeted it out last night. It was art by the Chicago Bears, just figuring out different ways to not score points.
Right down to the last play. Right down to the last play. It's just like everything about the last play, from like the referee not getting the call correct on the field and that needing to be sort of just quickly reviewed.
Again, if he gets the call right on the field, I bet you they go for it, right? They kick the field goal. Like it's right away.
It's not in the it's in the rule book. Like they were never going to, and I'll say, like, because I was on +7. So for all of those times down the field prior to that, and even obviously with like 10 seconds to go, where they sort of right there, that check down, and I'm like, oh, what are you doing? And then the guy steps out of bounds with 1 second left. As soon as he stepped out of bounds with 1 second left, like I knew I was done, because I knew even with the next touchdown that they weren't going to be even allowed to go for it, right? Whether it's an extra point or 2-point conversion, it's not up to the coaches anymore.
Got to rectify that. If you're the NFL and there are billions of dollars being gambled on your sport and the point spread is involved in the game, you can't end a game like that. And I'm not just saying that as someone who, like, and for the record, like, it's not like I bet a lot of money on said game. So it's not about that. Like that. I'm being serious.
And this wasn't Chargers Chiefs for me either, as far as like the wager size is concerned.
Yeah. I'm just saying fundamentally, if millions of dollars is switching hands on a play, like you can't just end the game like that if the point spread is involved. And I know there can't be that. Like there's no one buzzing down to the ref being like, hey, the point spread is blah, blah, blah. We got to have the final play. I'm just saying you can't end the game like that without kicking the extra point. That's just my opinion.
They would make the case. And listen, there's a possibility that you might be right. Like down the road, if betting becomes so important to them, which, I mean, listen, it's driven the success of the league.
They didn't even mention that on the broadcast. They didn't even mention anything of it. Well, they kind of did. Levy,
I think they might have said the rule, back to Minnesota Miracle. But I mean, at that point, like people are like freaking out. So, I mean, there's a lot going on. I mean, the thing is, like, if we're sort of talking about it from like a betting standpoint and they reinsert that rule and then, listen, there's 0 seconds left on the clock, right? Like the Bears could just come out, run a 2-point conversion play, and the Vikings aren't going to get in their way, right? Like they're not going to contest it. And then they run in some BS like thing where nobody's even trying, which I'm pretty sure is a type of thing that has happened before when that did exist, right? Like people are going to say the same thing. Those who are on the Vikings are going to be like, well, look, they didn't even try that 2-point, on that 2-point conversion with no time left. And it's like, well, why would they? But like, that's, BS too, right? And it's like, it's just optically a little bit better to just be like 0 seconds left in the game. Doesn't really matter, or doesn't matter at all when it comes to the result of the game. Let's just wrap it up. Because again, I mean, they can always hide under like player safety, right? And like, we don't want to play, have an extra play. And it's like, come on, player safety, like BS nonsense or whatever. So
speaking of BS nonsense,
Speaking
of BS nonsense, the Raiders. Or the Browns, I don't know, whichever way you want to go with that, really. So that was the other Monday nighter, as we had a double header of Monday nighters, which, hey, lucky us. The Raiders win this game on a last-second field goal for the win, 16-14. They don't cover the spread. We were on the Browns, but this was very interesting because the line moved a bunch of times over the weekend. And correct me if I'm wrong. Do I have this correct? Because the way that I saw it,
Right.
And you are obviously more plugged in than I am. But the way that I saw it, when we talked on Friday, it was Raiders -3. When it was announced that then the game was moved from Saturday to Monday, it flipped to Browns -3 because I'm assuming they thought maybe one of the quarterbacks would then be eligible to play. Correct. One of the first two Browns quarterbacks would be eligible to play, but they still don't make it out of protocol. So then the line flipped back to Raiders -3. Do I have that correct?
Yeah. I mean, it was a wild ride all week, right? Yeah. And you're just referencing back from Friday because we talked on Friday on the podcast about how on Thursday, I almost submitted Browns +1 in the big contest. And just before I was about to hit send, that's when the Case Keenum news came out. Right. And so when we talk about ratings and stuff like that and rating teams and sort of figuring out what the point spreads should be before the point spreads are announced and before they're opened and all of that sort of thing, like this is kind of this perfect thing where it's like the Raiders are just this static existence, right? Where it's like, nobody thought Darren Waller was going to be in. So obviously we're not going to rate the Raiders to the top end of their range. For whatever that ends up, whatever that is, right? That's probably league average or not even that, right? That's probably close to 50 in our sort of rating system. And they just sort of sit there as this like 45, right? Out of 100. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, like the Browns full group were -6 on Monday. And I even thought that was a little bit low because to have Browns rated a little bit higher than that. And then, you watch it toggle back and forth. And it's like, however many players are out, that's how far back we move the Browns from a rating standpoint. Right. And so, we get to see, okay, no Keenum, no Mayfield, and, then obviously Jadeveon Clowney. Like we talked about the idea that like, well, if the defensive line isn't banged, or isn't hit with any COVIDs, like we're okay here. And then sure enough, it was like Friday, Saturday, he gets popped as well. And so you just watch it and you go, okay, and it's going further and further and further away. And it ends up being Raiders -3. And if you're using a rating system, you're just sort of starting to see it bottom out. And this is sort of deep into the weeds here, but my sort of color coordinated rating system, like sort of has the Browns, literally the color brown between say 40 and like 75, right? Where it's like the worst it's ever going to get for the Browns is a 40 and the best it's ever going to really get for the Browns is a 75, unless they prove me wrong by just being consistently awesome. Well, that clearly hasn't been the case this season, so no worries on that standpoint. And as I'm sort of playing around with the numbers on how we get to, right, it's sort of, again, retrofit type thing. How do we get to a number where Browns +3 makes sense? Well, the rating for the Browns, again, knowing that we have this pretty constant number when it comes to the Raiders, the rating for the Browns like blows right through the color coordinated system and goes south of 40, 35, down into like the 30s. And so then it's just a matter of sitting there going like, okay, for the Browns to be at home, 3-point underdogs to a Raiders team who we have pretty firmly understood to be in the mid 40s, the Browns have to be this version of the Browns have to be a 30 out of 100 type of a team. Yeah. Again, we know, right, with Dearness Johnson, Nick Chubb, obviously. And then they end up getting Wyatt Teller back. We talked about how it'd be nice to get one guy back on the offensive line, at least somebody to run behind in a lot of cases, somebody who can do a decent job of pulling to the left side or the right side, et cetera, et cetera. And they get him back, but that doesn't do anything to the point spread, right? Like that doesn't change anything to the public perception of that game, but it changes how we rate the Raiders. And so at that point, the Browns. And so we sit there, we go, okay, they can't be 30. I'm willing to bet that the Browns aren't a 30 tonight at home with at least a couple of starters on their team. I'm willing to make that bet. And so that's what has you land on the +3 there for the Browns. And again, obviously we waited to see who was going to be available and how that was going to affect the line. And it just didn't compensate enough. Now, again, there's a bunch of different ways where the Raiders end up winning and covering that game with 14 points in the same way that Cousins and the Vikings ended up doing with 17 points later on, right? But it's just a matter of how bad are the Bears going to possibly be with their secondary guys out? Is the rating appropriate? And it's the same deal. It blew right through the color barrier, if you will, on my chart. And it's like, oh, they're now in the deep recesses of Excel that's not even covered by any sort of color. And it's like, oh, they can't be that bad. They cannot be that bad. Now, again, the Bears go and turn the ball over a billion times. And so I guess they could be that bad. But, again, that's just a fundamental numbers play when all of this chaos is happening, right? And you just go, anybody can sort of say, well, I think overvalued, undervalued, over exaggerated change in the point spread. At least it's right there, black and white for me, where I can see, okay, like the requirement for the Raiders to be -3 here is a Browns team that is playing at like a Texans style level here. And I just wasn't ready to believe that. And so that's what brought me on to the Browns. And again, luckily that ended up working out, because that was a game that, depending on when you bet it, and again, once they move the date of that game, a lot of bets get refunded. So it wasn't as crazy as you got bailed out if you had Browns -6 from last Monday, which again, there's a world in which I could have done that, because I think that number is short if the Browns are full strength. And that gets wiped out. And the people who bet like Raiders +200, that bet gets wiped out. And, again, unless your sportsbook is just letting things fly when it comes to date changes and stuff. So it ended up being a little bit tighter by the time that game got rescheduled with, again, -3 to +3. But like, that's a pretty big move as well. So just recognizing where these moves are over exaggerations and just betting against that. Unfortunately, it went 1-1 yesterday, but it absolutely should have been 2-0. Let's be honest.
Yeah. I mean, and that's one of those where I look at that at the end of the night and you're just like, all right, football, right? Like, there's room for that. There's room for that. Again. Speaking of said football, more interesting games, as you mentioned, a winning week in terms of picks handed out on said podcast, but a very funny game in terms of the ending, at least, was the Packers and the Ravens. Now, I'm pretty sure the Packers were, the last time we talked on Friday, the Packers were 5.5-point favorites against the Ravens. Now, I don't think Lamar was even listed as being officially out yet at that point either.
Right.
So then once that happened, the line obviously moves up. Either way, Packers win 31-30, but we're talking about Harbaugh going for 2 yet again. And to me, I don't even know why this is a discussion, because your quarterback is Huntley. You made a crazy run to come back to get the touchdown late. This is your best chance to what? What's your favorite line? Try and win the game, which is what he's trying to do, right?
Yeah, you're allowed to try and win the game. Yeah.
Yeah, like, hey, let's tie it up so we can maybe win a coin toss and maybe hope that Aaron Rodgers doesn't score a touchdown first, and maybe then Huntley. And it's like, no, go for the win. But are you still annoyed at the people who are arguing the go for 2 as opposed to don't go for 2? Or are you just like, let them have their own fun?
I mean, honestly, like, it's funny, right? Because like part of what I do and why I do this is to educate people as we get into this universe where, sports betting is in the landscape, right? And it's getting deeper into it, right? And that's why I get my sort of dander up, if you will, when I see bad sports betting content. I get my dander up when I see people just taking kind of let's just call it a dumb approach to sports, right? Like, there's so much information out there. It is easily digestible. It takes a minute. It takes 2 minutes to just understand some stuff. And again, the last people that I'm sort of rattled about necessarily are the, masses of just fans or sort of NFL enthusiasts who just refuse to sort of understand it, right? I get more worked up about the people who are paid to disseminate football information who still don't understand this sort of thing, right? Like we talked about the CBS like morning halftime crew just being a disaster last week, right? Like those are the ones, the boomers of the world, right? And so it's just like, we've talked about your boy Boog. And so like those are the ones that I get really sort of upset about, because it's like you're making it harder for me and for all of us to get better at this, right? And to be able to predict results of what coaches are going to do, because there's going to be a point 5, 10, hopefully sooner than that, years from now, where it's just going to be assumed that you're going to make some of these decisions, that it isn't going to be somebody just using the word analytics as if it's just this, like somebody cursed or something, right? Like it's just, the fear is going to be removed eventually, right? But as long as we have people sort of pushing back against that, it's just this uphill battle that's going to be really frustrating. Now, I then remind myself that we are betting into markets against people who don't understand this sort of thing. And that is to our advantage, right? If people are willing to sort of have their head in the sand, they're going to make bets that are similarly stupid, if you will. Yeah. And so I'm totally fine with all of that. So I'm not going to get too worked up about that. But here's the irony to this game. And by the way, you mentioned the Lamar Jackson thing. Again, another hilarious line where it was like, we're half in, we're half out, because this game is, if Lamar Jackson's healthy and everything's fine, right? Like the Ravens are going to be 2.5 point underdogs, right? Like you might end up getting a full 3 with the Ravens if you wanted, with a healthy Lamar Jackson, maybe a couple other guys who obviously were on the COVID list. But it's 5.5 all week, right? Which is obviously the 1 step in, 1 step out number, because once it gets
Vegas
announced, it goes up to 9.5. And then there was a 10 available. And that's where I jumped in on the 10. I wasn't dying to bet this game, but if you're going to give me 10, right? I was like, what is happening here, right? Like this is craziness. And so again, it's the same thing over and over. Now that game was a 14-point game. And that's the fundamental crux of all of this, is that game's a 14-point game. So even if you had taken the 10 as hard and as sort of tightly played as that game was for much of that game, you were still sort of on the outside looking in, right? And it just so happened that the Ravens, again, same spot as they were as the Bears were, the Ravens just did a better job of coming through the back door on that plus 10. Now, did they need to get a second touchdown? Not for my purposes, but for some people's purposes out there, right? That was a meaningful score. And once we were even going to go to overtime, again, unless you had taken the 5 and that was available early on in the week, then the sort of result from a point spread standpoint was settled. So I didn't really care what happened on that last play. But again, the irony, the point of all of this is to say, the analytics strategy in that game, as you know by now, is that when you're down 14 and you score a touchdown to be down 8, that's when you go for 2, right? That is the analytically correct move, to go for 2 when you're down 8, to try to make it a 6-point game, so that last touchdown is just an extra point from Justin Tucker away from taking the lead in that game. And I say taking the lead, not winning that game, because that's the other thing lost in all of this, right? So fundamentally, if we were doing it by the analytics book, the 2-point conversion would have been attempted already. So John Harbaugh, in that instance, is not doing the analytically correct thing because it already passed him by. He already missed that opportunity to do the analytically correct thing, something that I believe he has done before. So it's not that he's unfamiliar with it. So I couldn't tell you why he didn't do it. I'm also, whether it's Staley not going for the 2-point conversion on Thursday, or some of these other guys that are really aggressive. Well, even though, again, if it's just analytics, you're not being aggressive. You are literally playing to the percentage. Right? In this case, Harbaugh was being aggressive because he wasn't playing to the percentages necessarily. And here's why. When you go for 2, right, there's all the numbers. And listen, if you've listened to this podcast for 5 seconds in the past, you know that we have a healthy respect for the numbers here. But for all the numbers that swirl around when it comes to a 2-point conversion, et cetera, what isn't necessarily quantifiable yet, and maybe it becomes that way eventually if we get enough of these sample sizes, is what's the urgency from the Packers with that last 42 seconds, something along those lines. In that last 40 some odd seconds, what's their urgency to score if the game is tied relative to if they are down 1, right? The difference there, I think, has to be taken into account. Now, people say, well, they're still going to try to score. Like Rodgers is still going to try to score. But if you're down 1, you're going to sling it around. It's different. You're going to sling it around pretty aggressively. If a ball gets picked off on your first or second throw, or if you get strip sacked or something along those lines, it's not that big of a deal because you were going to lose anyway down 1. But if it's tied, right, you don't have that same urgency level. And so the idea that the Packers have the same probability to go down the field and kick a field goal when they have that same level of urgency doesn't really add up to me, right? And so that's where you have to sort of factor in, okay, like it's a, again, we always talk about 2-point conversion being a 50-50 probability. You've got the 50-50 probability, and it isn't win-lose. It's either lose now or take a lead and give Aaron Rodgers motivation, extra urgency to get down the field, to try a couple extra throws, to try that sort of thing, right? Which you say, okay, great. Well, if he's going to try some throws, like that's a chance for him to make a bad one or to, again, get strip sacked. But again, you already had the lead, right? Like it would just be sort of confirming the lead that you already had. So you have to factor that in. So that's why I said, I'm like, I didn't love going for it. If you weren't going to go for it on the first touchdown, I didn't love going for it on the second touchdown because you're giving Aaron Rodgers urgency in that next drive, right? Whereas, okay, if we're going to just do this, let's just go to overtime and then literally maybe put it up to a coin flip, right? Where at that point you are now 50-50 because when you're going 2-point conversion and Aaron Rodgers drive, that's a 50% probability plus whatever percentage you want to assign to Aaron Rodgers getting that field goal, which, again, it's Aaron Rodgers. We always just assume the most positive, result. He is, of course, going to drive down the field. Like, God forbid he'd ever make a mistake. And so that's the difference in all of this. And so the funny thing is like people are railing on Harbaugh because, analytics lost him another game. And again, first and foremost, they're saying this because he did it against the Steelers as if they were going to win the game if that game went to overtime, right? Like, again, the assumption, no one's has more faith in a team doing something when their coach doesn't allow them to do that thing, right? Like you and I have a history of talking about the Packers Bucks game from last season where they kicked the field goal or whatever instead of letting Aaron Rodgers on 4th and 7 or 4th and goal from the 7, like, oh, you gotta, and like it's just on the assumption that Aaron Rodgers is going to be successful, right? It's like that kick decision will go down in history as quote unquote dumb because everyone's assumed that Aaron Rodgers was going to convert a 4th and 7, right? Like that's just how our minds work, evidently, right? In the same way people are going to give field goals to the Chargers automatically, even though we watch the Chargers miss field goals all the time. So again, all of that is to say that wasn't the analytically correct decision, but he's getting sort of blamed for using analytics like he didn't. And then we see there's an audio clip going around where Harbaugh, even before the drive, is walking around to his guys. I don't know if you've heard this, like mic'd up thing, but he's going around asking guys, hey, if we score a touchdown on this drive, do you guys want to go for 2? Like, do you want to try to win it here? And he's incorrect by saying win it here, but he's sort of selling it to his players. And whether he knows he's mic'd up or not, I don't know. But once you do that, like, what are the players going to say? We've talked about this before. Are they going to say nah, man, let's play OT? Like, I don't think we can get this. Like, oh no, of course, like they're going to say yes, right? And I often rail on coaches when they send kickers out to try 55-yarders on 4th and 2, because if you go for it on 4th and 2 and it doesn't work, the players don't get blamed. The coach gets blamed for going for it on 4th and 2, i.e. Brandon Staley. But if you shoot the kicker out there to try to make a kick that other kickers have made historically in the past, not at a particularly high percentage, by the way, but they have made it. When the kicker misses it, it's, idiot kicker, right? Like, kicker just missed that kick. Coach did everything right. Nobody blames the coach for the kick that gets missed. They blame the kicker. So in this case, Harbaugh is just putting his players out there going, all right, you guys make the decision. I might get beat up about this for 24 hours, but the mic is going to pick up that I asked you guys if you wanted to do this, right? Now he has this sort of, deniability to like, I mean, I didn't know, but like I asked my guys and I'm going to trust my guys, right? And it's like, no, man, like analytically, you should have done that on the previous touchdown. And that's the point everybody's missing here as they beat up Harbaugh for using analytics when he didn't even do that. This was that gamble, right? Like this was, like you said, that aggressiveness. And I don't hate him for doing it because I like the aggressiveness.
Yeah, I know what you're saying.
But let's not just call it analytics just because a guy went for it. That's not it, right? No, that's not what analytics are.
That's the labels, right? And sometimes even in relationships, labels can become problems, right? And I think that's what happens a lot here as well with analytics, and just because people are dug in on their sides, regardless of what side you're on. And so it almost becomes either a bad word or like, you're not a part of the cool crowd. It's one or the other. When really, I just think And as I said, right, I never said anything about analytics. I just said I thought Harbaugh in that moment is thinking, this might be my best chance to win this game with Huntley, right, with my backup QB against Aaron Rodgers. Like in that like one play, and I understand what you're saying, and I understand the math and all that. I'm just saying I don't think he's even thinking of it in that sense, right?
Yes,
he's just saying
you're right.
In this moment, one play to try and win. So
and
either
Huntley
way,
was
interesting
great.
stuff.
Huntley was great, and it needs to be, and it needs to be mentioned, right? We're not talking Mike Glennon, right? We're not talking about some of these other backup quarterbacks, right? And like, surprise, surprise, a well-run organization has a quarterback who, again, fits a lot of the style with which they play, right? Like they're not running Joe Flacco out there if Lamar Jackson gets hurt, right? Like they can run all of the same plays by and large. And he's a second-year guy who had some success at Utah. Like this isn't a guy off the street. We always refer to our guy, the Nooch, Ben DiNucci. It's like this isn't that situation, right? We don't have
I forgot
random.
About that. That was a moment in time.
Yes, that's right. Right. Like this is a quality backup who, again, if he plays a bunch of games here, is probably going to be sought after here in the market. I don't know what his contract situation is, but like, I get it. And that's why I don't disagree with it. I'm just saying I don't love it. It wasn't analytics. And the thing that drives me, the label, and just the idea that like, stupid Harbaugh and his analytics. It's like, well, no, if you want to be stupid Harbaugh, just call him stupid for being over aggressive. And then that's a debate that people can have. But you and I are going to like that decision, not because it was analytically correct. We're going to like that decision because it was aggressive and it was trusting his players and all of those sort of old school type of things, right? Like the old school crowd should have liked that decision a little bit more than the analytical crowd. And that, again, that's not how this is getting sort of portrayed.
For sure. Tough go at it for Mr. Tom Brady, who struggled again against the New Orleans Saints. We talked about it on Friday, how somehow, some way, the Saints just always play well against the Bucs. And we were looking at that spread and thinking it was 11 points. That's a lot of points, right?
And it went up.
Neither team scored 11 points. It was 9-0, right? Which is the funniest part of this whole thing. It went under
the total of 11 and a half. Yeah.
Which is absolutely amazing. But Tom Brady gets shut out, and we're going to see the highlights over and over again of him tossing the iPad or whatever, the playbook, whichever brand it is. You're going to see him cursing at the sidelines of the Saints. But this is what I don't understand, okay? Like, if we remember correctly, all of these games, like it's very, like, that's not a deep dive. That's not like anything crazy. How does that spread end up being at 11 and a half and moving up? And I know the injuries played a factor, right? In game, the injuries definitely did play a factor for the Bucs for sure. But I mean, they weren't going to cover. I don't think they might have won the game. You could convince me maybe they win the game if all those guys don't get hurt, but I don't think they come close to covering.
No, I don't think so either. Right. Like, I think pretty early on, I'd say through one quarter, you're like, okay, like this is the game that, by the way, this is the game that it's been, right. Every other time these two teams met. Right. And so I talked about it, on what the piece for the score that I wrote for this game and just online, like just the idea that like, it's like if you have this file cabinet of, handicaps, right? Like for these different matchups, and you just sort of like Dewey Decimal System, you look up, right? Saints, Bucks. Okay.
Nobody knows what the Dewey Decimal System is listening to this pod, right?
Okay. That's okay. So you Google Saints Buccaneers handicap, and then you hit print. Do printers still exist? And you just sort of print out the file of like these two teams matching up, and you just go, okay, all right, like Saints own them, defensively, relatively speaking, and like blah blah blah. It's like I didn't have to do any work when it came to finding this bet, right? I had done the work back in week 8 when we correctly predicted that the Saints would beat the Buccaneers back in that first matchup, back in the old days when Jameis Winston was rolling around, right? And so we talked about the idea this the switch of this point spread, right? Where it was, 4.5 in New Orleans back in week 8, and now it's 11.5. And that's a 7-point swing, right? Which would indicate a 3.5 point home field advantage for both teams. Neither of these teams have a 3.5 point home field advantage. I'm here to tell you that right now. And so that was an over-adjustment. You said, like, well, why is that? Well, it's because in everybody's perception, they don't have a functional passing quarterback, and the Buccaneers' run defense is some scary thing. What the reality is, the run defense hasn't been very good for the Bucs over the last 4, 5, or 6 weeks, right? They have gotten gashed. Now, they didn't necessarily get gashed in this game either. There was, again, there was a couple of good throws from Taysom Hill, which again is all you need when your defense is owning the other team, right? And so how do you get to a 12, 13, 14 point victory if your offense can't score the way that it's, grown accustomed to? So, again, there's not that much more to say about it other than, like, yes, if you were on the Saints and injuries started to pile up for the Buccaneers, you started feeling a lot better, obviously, about your chances to cover that game and even the win, right? Until they get that third field goal. It just felt like, okay, the Bucs are going to have one touchdown drive here at some point, right? But again, that just goes to show any given Sunday, all of that sort of thing. So, I mean, did we have the under 11.5? No, but we had the plus 11.5 in that game and won it relatively comfortably because all we had to do, was just go back, find the work that we had done before and just use that to be able to get a pretty easy victory, which is nice considering how well we handicap some of these games, like the Bears game last night. And it doesn't work out for a bunch of crazy reasons. It's nice to have one that was just pretty basic, cut and dry type of a game.
For sure. One thing I like to say, trusting the reads, right? Trusting the reads, and definitely along those exact same lines. The Detroit Lions, as on Friday, it was 12.5 point underdogs, but I'm pretty sure it went up. They win outright against the Arizona Cardinals, 30-12. And, the cover is one thing. I can say that, hey, we talked about it last week. We talked about, definitely like the Lions to cover here. Who is Arizona? We're still trying to figure that out. I didn't have the Lions winning convincingly in this game at all.
No.
But here we are. And I mean, is this a sign of, just we really don't know much about the Cards? Like, we're finding out more and more about the Cards as time goes along, and they were just overrated because a lot of moving pieces. They're missing, obviously, DeAndre Hopkins a lot more than we might have given credit to beforehand. But outright win for the Lions. Wow, man, Campbell.
Yeah. And shout out to the Lions, by the way. I've referenced it before. My over 1.5 wins for the Detroit Lions that I made before they played the Steelers back when they tied the Steelers. My in-season over 1.5 win ticket cashes with the second victory
amazing
for the Lions.
That gets a slow
shout out.
That gets a slow clap.
Shout out. The only in-season win total bet that I made all season long, the only win total bet I think I made all season long, cashes with the Lions over 1.5. Absolutely absurd. Honestly, when it comes to the Cardinals and sort of like what's going on with this team, like, I just think it's small sample size. And that's what we talked about with regards to, like them, obviously the Colt McCoy stuff and coming in and playing really well and also playing really badly in that same, entity, right? Like, people love the Cardinals because they're just one of those teams. They're like the Chargers, where it's just like, it's kind of really fun when like those teams are good. And I don't know why necessarily that is. I don't know if it's like a West Coast type of thing or what, but like, we want those teams to be really good. And we want the spectacular, the Justin Herbert throws, the Kyler Murray runs, the DeAndre Hopkins catches. We want that to translate into greatness on the field, because when it does, it's spectacular to watch. When it's just kind of 2 or 3 plays a game and then everything else is just kind of okay, that's kind of bums us out a little bit, right? And but it also creates a little bit of value fading that team. And so when we look at the whole picture here with the Cardinals, again, we've talked about it. We go through it. We go, okay, first 49ers game, early season against the Vikings, early season again, against a couple of other teams where it's like, okay, yeah, they won, but they didn't necessarily cover at home. And then, you look at the 49ers, right? Small sample size early on in the season. Like, you and I already, Kyle Shanahan, like, this ain't it. Like, if the 49ers played the Cardinals right now, How interesting would that game be? How interesting would that point spread be? How different would that point spread be relative to what it was in the past and just the general perception of how to bet that game if that game existed? And who knows? That game might exist come playoff time. And are you going to bet the Cardinals in that game? I can tell you, we haven't even seen the point spread, but I am probably not going to do that, right? And so all of this just comes back to ratings, right? And for the first 12 some odd weeks of the season, I would post my ratings over at the Score and sort of write about how they change on a week-to-week basis. And then after about 12 weeks or so, they just sort of exist, right? Like the last ratings are probably going to be ones that we keep throughout the rest of the season, and maybe things get adjusted because of injuries and that sort of thing. But we don't really need to talk about that on a week-to-week basis from a big picture standpoint. And so my point is like, I never had the Cardinals rated number one because, again, I need these ratings for how I'm going to bet a team going forward. And if I don't think that this team is something that I want to be backing going forward against the other high quality teams in the league, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, listen, we've been trying to find other quality teams and some teams have desired not to, fill that role. The Bills have been up and down. The Chiefs have been up and down, etc. But like, I was never ready to put the Cardinals atop that rating because I didn't want to be betting the Cardinals going forward because there just was never going to be value on them because I didn't see early on in the season why I should just consider this team the number one team in the league. And so I didn't. And listen, it's easy to sort of pat ourselves on the back here, but like they are clearly not the best team in the league. And like maybe they end up, home game, first round division championship, that sort of thing. Well, like that loss to the Rams last week is going to be problematic. And obviously losing to the Lions wasn't something that was in the win probabilities when it came to who's going to win this division. So going to be interesting down the stretch here. They got a coin flip game coming up here on Christmas against the Colts. That's going to be incredibly interesting and might actually garner a bet on the Cardinals because maybe things have flipped for both of those teams, right? The Colts are really riding high in the public perception zone and the Cardinals aren't. So again, I think it's just small sample size when you have seasons that, feel like they're really long, but only have 12 games in them, through the end of November, early December. Like that's the kind of thing that's going to happen. We're going to overrate and underrate teams based on small sample size.
Very interesting, my dude. Very interesting. I thought at one point there, you're going to say a win wasn't in the cards.
Oh, well, as much as I like a good pun, I need to probably sit down and think about 5 minutes before I come up with something that rudimentary, sadly.
As we move on, though, to another NFC West squad that I'm quite familiar with, San Francisco 49ers. They were big boy favorites against the Falcons, and I was very easily taking the Falcons plus the points. And then the game kicks up, and the reminder is just this simple. The Niners are a different team when Kittle and Debo are both healthy. Yeah. It's just really as simple as that. I mean, Jimmy G is going to do what Jimmy G does. He's just throwing it up. But the ability of those dudes with the yak yards just adds a whole different dimension. They're just running crossing patterns or just like wide receiver screens and just taking them like mad yards after the catch. So Jimmy G is going to Jimmy G. The running game by committee is going to be the running game by committee. But if Kittle and Debo are healthy, I mean, they're going to look pretty good against most teams in the NFL. Do I think they can make a run in the playoffs? No. But
okay.
But they're a pretty good team.
Yeah. So that's interesting. Like from a point spread standpoint, right? Like, I mean, you watched that game, felt like the Falcons probably should have at least covered in that game, right?
Yeah,
you get
Falcons
inside,
were hanging around. Falcons were hanging around.
You get in the red zone 3 times and you get 0 points out of it. Obviously, listen, I'll say it right now, mega shenanigans at the start of that game when they call back the Cordell Patterson touchdown.
Yeah.
Right. And now, of course, listen, you're at the 1 foot line, like score the touchdown on the next play or the play after that, or the play after that, right? But like it never should have come to that. And it sort of had it had Chargers Chiefs vibes in a lot of ways, where you have special teams play at the start of the game, right? And obviously the Chargers case, it was Andre Roberts breaking free. He trips up, he doesn't get into the end zone, and even that should have been the first signal that some janky stuff was going to happen in that game. Yeah. Well, 49ers was hasty or something like that. I think like he takes the ball in the face and the Falcons recover the muffed kick, if you will, and then can't convert and end up getting 0 points. And the other team ends up, getting the ball back in bad field position, right? Like it all had the same kind of vibes. There's a bunch of different times throughout the rest of the game too, where the Falcons should have and could have covered the game. And that's the game of the week where we would be talking about, man, like they had every opportunity to cover. How did they not? Except for the Bears came around and somehow one-upped them or like 3-upped them when it came to visits to the red zone. So, interesting take on your part on that, on the fact that you don't necessarily think that this team is sort of built for the playoffs, because I mean, everything comes down to matchups and like it sort of feels a little built for the playoffs, right? Brandon Ayuk, a guy that we were waiting on. A lot of fantasy football players out there waiting on Brandon Ayuk for a long time. And like you mentioned, obviously Debo, who again, like I'm ready to go, speaking of like old school attitudes when it comes to stuff, I'm ready to start talking Debo Samuel MVP talk out here. Right. Whoa. Like I know it's like an old school thing and like, oh, it's got to be a quarterback. It's got to be a quarterback. But we've talked all season about like which quarterback is going to take it here. And like, as much it was like Tom Brady's now the odds on favorite, he just got shut out at home. Right. And I understand like Debo doesn't get the blame when bad stuff like that happens. But like, what else do you need to see? Right. Like when this guy's not in the lineup, it's a much different team. It's the same thing for Kittle. And I suppose, now we have to start talking, well, Kittle is also most valuable to that team as well. And I get that, but like the numbers add up. Like Samuel was leading the league or second in the league in receiving yards until they were like, yeah, man, we actually need you to play some running back here because things are getting pretty grim from a running back position standpoint. He's like, yeah, sure. And now they have this play, that runs off the left side that scores a touchdown every single time. And it's like, what else do you want from a guy here? So I don't know if that gains traction down the stretch here. I've made jokes on the Score Twitter spaces that we do. Haven't been able to do the last couple of weeks, but we've been able to do previous to that about sort of the concept of Chipper Jonesing your way to an MVP. There's a season, way back 15 years ago where Chipper Jones just got crazy hot in September for the Atlanta Braves and was hitting all these home runs and came out of nowhere and like just won the MVP because it was like, man, he single-handedly just dragged the team to the playoffs. Debo Samuel right now is out here Chipper Jonesing this 49ers team. They're not going to win the division, but they're going to make the playoffs here. And they're going to be problematic because I don't think this is a team that has to be at home for success in the playoffs.
That part is
they just need they just need Jimmy G to not turn the ball over, which again, depending on the matchup, is either more likely or less likely to happen, but we'll see. They could be very live underdogs come this playoff run, which I'm starting to get excited about the concept of playoff football here as we still have 3 weeks left in the regular season.
A couple things, though. The disrespect of not even considering Jimmy G for MVP.
Right.
I couldn't even get that out with a straight face.
Right.
But the one thing I do find very interesting, too, as watching this Niners team, and maybe it's kind of make me feel some type of way, but if they are on the brink of making a run, it makes you wonder, like, what if they didn't make the Trey Lance trade and just drafted dudes that would have helped the team this season? Do you know what I mean? It's interesting. And that's a hindsight game, and I don't want to really get into that. Just want to make that point and move on because we got some stuff coming.
Yeah, but like you're a 49ers fan, right? Like you were all in on them getting a quarterback, right? I think, everybody was sort of like, okay, we need to move on, right? So it's like, that would be one that's mega revisionist when it comes to like, nobody
I'm fully aware of what I'm doing.
Yeah. Fair call.
I'm fully aware of what I'm doing here. Don't get me wrong. Being salty,
but like a JC Horn would look nice in the defensive backfield.
Sure.
Right. Definitely. Like if they hadn't traded up and they, they're in that sort of spot, like a Patrick Surtain would look pretty nice, but I get you.
Sure. Yeah. Also looking nice is our Tuesday because we got 2 NFL games looking real nice just because we'll take any day they want to just give us some NFL games. Sure. Why not?
Yeah.
Here for it. So we got some games here and the Seahawks are at the Rams. And before this line was nicely in the Vegas zone at 4.5. And now it's up to 7 for the Rams at home. I mean, here's the thing to me with this game and this line. The Seahawks, I think they're like we're counting down the last games of Russell Wilson in Seattle. And I don't know if this is going to go too well. I don't like it at 7 because I think that's too many points. But I need you to talk me out of laying the points just because if it's 7, it pushes. I wish for 7.5, then I'd have to take the Seahawks, but I don't really want anything to do with the Seahawks here.
I liked the Seahawks when Tyler Lockett was going to play in this game. I liked them a lot. I like them a lot. So full roster, both sides, everything, all things being equal, like I have this number about 4.5. Okay. So when the Rams, had their issues last week, it was, dropped the number from 7 down to 4.5. Mm-hmm. And so, if the Rams have a bunch of COVID issues and I like the full strength at 4.5, then I would like it 4.5, right? I like the Seahawks plus 4.5 with a messed up Rams team, right?
Yeah.
Now it appears, most of these guys are going to be back. Obviously you never know, right? By the time we publish this podcast, who knows what could be happening when it comes to this lineup. And so, now I have to, take something off of the Seahawks with Lockett not being there for Russell Wilson. Does that get me all the way up to 7? Nah, not really, right? It's probably closer to like a 6.5, right? So I'm going to be on the Seahawks in this game. But because it's the same thing as it was with the Browns and the same thing that it was with the Bears, where the Bears were already, I was ready to make them a best bet at like a plus 4.5 with all things being equal. It's the same way here. I mean, quite literally, I was willing to have the Seahawks be a best bet at plus 4.5 if all things were being equal. I can't right now, right? It just has to be a regular bet for me. And we're getting 7, which is good because again, as much as Lockett and, some of these other players are relevant, I suppose, it's the same story. It's the same story as Ravens Packers.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like every other game that we just talked about that has been hit by COVID, you wait, you see how inflated it could possibly get. And then you bet on the team that has the COVID issues at the best possible number, right? And so you can wait and see, and maybe the 7.5 does appear the same way that it did yesterday, but I'll probably just take the 7 at like a minus 105 and then just sort of take my chances there. But the problem is with all of the news and, switches and all of this sort of stuff, you can't make any of this stuff really a best bet, right? Like you can't walk into Ravens plus 10. I mean, listen, if it was Ravens plus 10 on Friday, it absolutely would have been a best bet. By the time Sunday rolls around, it's just like, all right, this is just a regular bet for me. So yeah, this is a regular bet for me, plus 7 on the Seahawks. I can't trust it any more than that. But again, we're talking about the addiction that is NFL football, right? We watch these games, we watch these referees botch things and just throw flags and give out 47-yard penalty, pass interference penalties when it's just 2 guys standing next to each other with some slight hand fighting. Like we are mega addicted to this league. And so, yeah, there's got to be a bet somewhere, right? And Seahawks plus 7 is that bet for me tonight.
Very interesting. Very interesting. I guess it's one of those where I should be trusting the normal rules to removing the teams and looking at just the line of being 7 points in a divisional game. Okay. Interesting. Take the points. I'm going to be honest here. I'm going to lean here on taking the points, but hoping that it's going to get to 7.5 just because that's what I think might possibly happen as we get closer to game time and people talk themselves into the Rams. The other game, we got the football team at the Philadelphia Eagles. This game was Eagles 9.5 and now it's down to 6.5. And it's funny because I remember thinking I can't take the Eagles to be favored by 9.5 against anybody, even the football team. And now I don't have to worry about that because it's down to 6.5. And even still, I'm kind of thinking, okay, football team. I think I would need that to, funny enough, get back to 7, right? For me to be on the football team. I think that's what I'm leaning here. I liking Eagles at a touchdown, but I'm wavering here. Talk me into which side you're leaning here. If there is a lean, because again, COVID.
That's right. No, yeah, we there's a lean, and we just leaned ourselves. We've fallen over. And by the way, like the Seahawks Rams thing, like all these other things, like the rules are the rules, but like doesn't guarantee anything, right? Like there's a bunch of different ways the Ravens don't cover that number. There's a bunch of different ways that certainly the Bears didn't cover, but they couldn't. You're right. They might not have, or they might have, and all of these things, right? It's still just the end of the day, giving yourself the best chance to win a bet and create the most probability going your way. So again, if you get that plus 7.5, whether it was last night or tonight, you're creating a little extra win probability for yourself here, right? And so when it comes to Washington and Philadelphia, and it's hilarious, you reference them as the football team, and it's just so stupid. Like just call like this. The name is so dumb that it's just like how we're not laughing every time somebody refers to them as just football team. But can we call them a football team when like none of the players actually professionally play football? Like we were this close, or we were at least this past weekend, this close to just 20, 25 guys, like just dudes straight up off of the street, right? And so whether it ends up being Kyle Allen or Taylor Heineke, and if Taylor Heineke plays, is that a good thing for Washington, versus comparing those two players from that game against the Cowboys a week or so ago? I don't know. I don't, maybe, right? Like sometimes Taylor Heineke looks good and then sometimes he does not. I'll put it this way. This is Eagles or nothing for me here. And the difference here is you're going to say like, well, what about the adjustment? Well, okay. Put it this way. This opened 3.5 or 3.5, 4.5. Hard to tell, right? These days. Given the fact that things change so quickly, and would have been all about the Eagles, even as a full roster on both sides type of thing. Because when it comes to COVID positives and having to replace and moving, so I'm going to refer to the Bears here as, I'm not going to refer to them as a quality organization, but they are sort of on the ledger of like getting it done correctly. But again, all situations are different. Organizationally, I don't trust the Washington football team to handle everything that they've had to handle over the last week, right? I trust the Baltimore Ravens to handle that. I trust even the Cleveland Browns, like playing a home game with the system that they have in place as far as being a run-heavy, run-focused team. I even trust the Chicago Bears to do so from at least a talent standpoint on defense. On defense. And by the way, I also mistrust the Minnesota Vikings to be able to take advantage of issues, right? So like there's a lot of like, as much as we sort of talk about the rules here, there are some situation by situation type situations. Yeah. And you go like, well, okay, like, but Washington, like what about them gives you sort of any level of trust that you should feel about how they're going to handle it. And that would be fine if this game was 9.5. Again, or if it had bumped up to 10.5, which is maybe where it would or could have gone. That would have me going like, yeah, the rules are the rules. And as much as I don't trust Washington, like that's cool. In this case, like I can not trust Washington and still get a decent number. Now I was able to grab -6 yesterday, -115 on the sort of just in case this goes to overtime and we need some sort of backup plan to get ourselves out of here with a push or something along those lines.
Since that's
unfortunately that's the thing. -6.5 here. I am fine with that number. Anything under 7 is still worth it for me with an Eagles team that, somehow has avoided all of this sort of thing, right? And has been able to focus for the last week on what they need to do. And if we're talking about teams getting an advantage from the postponements from Saturday, I actually think the Eagles have a pretty good advantage here because Jalen Hurts got a couple extra days to get healthy, right? They didn't have to deal with testing and like hoping these guys get back in and like, let's buy us some time to just get some players back. Meanwhile, the Eagles just get more prep, more practice prep, more health, et cetera, et cetera. So actually, I think this works out a lot better for the Eagles than it does for Washington. And you're not paying necessarily a tax. Like you might be paying a couple of points from where it was, -4, -4.5 before all of this happened. That's not going to be enough for me to like be scared away from the Eagles here against an organization here who I don't trust to handle what's happened here well at all. So yeah, give me the Eagles -6.5. I think they win this game relatively comfortably.
I mean, you are correct in the sense that it will forever be ironic that the football team sucks at football.
That's right.
Right? Like, this is pretty interesting.
And almost ran out a bunch of guys who don't play football professionally. Like, are we sure? Like the sorta football team? Can we put that into the mix? At least if they're the sorta football team, we could call them the WSFT. And I wouldn't keep wanting to put WTF every time I short form the Washington football team, which I think is a common problem out there for everybody involved.
This is correct. And maybe the WFT is more fitting of a name for said organization. But hey, I digress. Before we get to the Sunday Nighter, though, I would just like to give a nice reminder to the people about the DRF Sports Sunday Scoop e-newsletter. If you haven't done so already, make sure you sign up for free at drf.com/sports to receive 2 free weekly newsletters delivered to your email inbox every Friday and Sunday. Both are packed with powerful betting angles you don't want to miss. So make sure you sign up for the Sunday Scoop e-newsletter and check out our guy Scott Grambling's weekly 6-pack in both the NFL and NCAA. And of course, he also has his in-depth game previews. All that and more, drf.com/sports. Everything you need in terms of betting angles, we've got you covered. But the aforementioned Thursday Nighter involves the aforementioned San Francisco 49ers, who are on the road in Tennessee, favored by 3.5 points. Here we are. We're talking Niners as road favorites at over a field goal. I mean, short week. I mean, Debo. And here's the thing. Here's my thing here.
Yeah.
The problem with Debo and Kittle, right? They get banged up all the time because they play hard football, right? They're taking hits.
Yeah.
Now you're asking them to do that on a short week against the Tennessee Titans team. Now, I'm not saying the Titans are great. Obviously not. But if I just go to the rules, let's say, quote unquote, the home dogs, I mean, in this instance, that's where I'm leaning. I'm leaning on the home dogs and the points, but I could just be jaded against my own Niners.
No, listen, I think that's a fair take. So a couple of different things, right? Like, yeah, you have the road team on a short week, right? Like, that's tough. This isn't a non-existent travel thing. This is a pretty extensive travel spot here for the 49ers, a team that, again, is getting a lot of credit right now for this little run that they've been on, right? Couple of, listen, it wasn't all that dramatic against the Falcons, right? But it was certainly a nice win, but the dramatic win before that against the Cincinnati Bengals and obviously the Rams win from a couple of weeks prior to that. Like, they are hot right now. And it's funny, right? Like, we talk about like the small sample size that is the NFL, because 5 games ago, maybe, what is the line in this game? Like, isn't it Titans -3? Right, at the very least, as the team that we
Shanahan's coaching for his job.
Like it's just like, this is what happens, right? We always talk about like hockey or NBA or whatever. Like, 5 games is nothing in those leagues, right? Like, that is a week and a half, and you wouldn't drastically overreact to a week and a half. And so, just because it's spread out over the course of 5 or 6 weeks here, now we see the 49ers as 3.5 point road favorites here. And that's just too much, right? Like, I'd love to back the 49ers, right? I'll put it this way. Before the season, one of my futures, you can go back to the preview show, was 49ers to win the NFC at +600. Like, that's all of a sudden not looking all that bad anymore, because, again, I think this team is built for the playoffs. So I like the 49ers, but we're talking about up over a field goal at this point for a number that my numbers make 1.5 for the 49ers. And that's with the market fluctuation, right? The Titans coming down in the ratings and the 49ers coming up, and them essentially switching spots or sort of passing each other on the road of my ratings here, going opposite directions. All of that factored in still has the 49ers only about a 1.5 point favorite here. So anything above 3, I think, needs to be a take on the Titans. Now, that's going to be uncomfortable because this Titans team not looking all that great over the last few weeks. And, Tannehill and all of that sort of thing, right? Like, Tannehill, is he a poor man's Jimmy G? Is he a rich man's Jimmy G? Like, we may never know. But again, the Titans, I think, can, right? Like, I don't even really know, right? Like, Tannehill's got Jimmy G vibes or the other way around. I don't really. All I know is that we get 3.5 points here with the home team on a short week, a team that's like, let's just be honest, right? It's not hard. You don't need an elaborate rating system or even a basic rating system to sort of understand that the 49ers are being valued really highly in the marketplace. Now, again, they could meet that valuation, right? They could be that good, and the Titans could be that quote unquote bad. This is just one of those spots, right? Whether it was early in the season where the Bills came to town to face the Titans, right? It's funny, like there was a part in the season where the Bills were 6.5-point favorites at the Titans, and then the Titans won that game and won a bunch of more games, and then they became the team that was heavily valued, and then now they're the team that's undervalued. Like the Titans have been on their own personal roller coaster here as well that matches the 49ers every step of the way for twists and turns. So yeah, I mean, I just think it's a fundamental basic bet here that you have to make here. Tennessee plus 3.5, going to be uncomfortable when Deebo Samuel and George Kittle are just absolutely running through guys' faces out there. But like that's just where we're at here with the marketplace, where unfortunately we can't take the 49ers here because they're 3.5-point road favorites on a short week. I mean, fundamentally, that's just kind of brutal.
Oof, yes, very, very true, my dude. Very, very true. As we continue to look ahead, though, there's some other football action taking place, maybe some college basketball action taking place as well. But I think I hear some music. I'm not sure. I didn't know that this was happening, but I feel like I hear the music. Do we have some picks here to wrap things up here in the college world?
It's not quite NFL primetime with Boom and Tej as far as getting people excited about the hurry up offense here from a music standpoint, but here we are. So college football bowl games are a robust 5-4 through the first 9 bowl games. Famous Idaho Potato Bowl here getting kicked off shortly, depending on where you are right now. This one, I mean, listen, we're not going to love every single game here. I don't love this game, but if we're getting Kent State plus 3.5, I'll take that. That being said, if you're a pool player out there, Wyoming, if you can get them at minus 2.5. I think 3 is a key number for these two teams. I expect this game to be relatively close. I do understand why Wyoming's favorite. I think 3.5 is a little high for a Kent State team who has a high variance level. So who knows, right? They could win this game by 21. They could lose this game by 21. The Frisco Bowl, UTSA and San Diego State. This is one I might just be taking an L on this game. I bet UTSA minus 2.5 well before I knew that Sincere McCormick, star running back for UTSA, was going to opt out of this game to go to the NFL draft. Completely understand that from a personal standpoint from him. I don't understand why all of a sudden now, just because of that, though, this line has flipped to San Diego State minus 3. So I'll probably be taking an L here where you guys might be able to take a W, because if UTSA is a 3-point underdog, like I would absolutely take that against San Diego State team who still doesn't have the better quarterback in this game. Like, yeah, has the better defense and special teams with their all-world punter, but like 3 points here for San Diego State, just because a running back is not playing, like, how we feel about the replacement level, concept of running backs here. So UTSA and the Roadrunners plus 3 that you can get if you make that bet today. Bet that you can't make today, right? We giveth and we taketh away here. The Armed Forces Bowl, Missouri and Army. I grabbed this. This is my biggest bet of the bowl season here. Army minus 3. Bad news is the reason that it's a big bet is because that was a bad number, and this number has gone up to 4.5 for Army. So again, if you are betting Army now, understand that you don't have that backup plan of landing on 3 or 4 in this game. The one thing, as this game continues to go on, or sort of the lead up to this game continues to go on, and the number keeps falling from a total standpoint, I think both teams are going to be able to score on each other here. So over 56.5 might be something if, listen, you don't want to get all into the messy grind that is this point spread and being late to the number, if you will. Maybe the total is something for you on Wednesday just to be able to play something in that game. Thursday, we've got the Frisco Classic, not to be confused with the Frisco Bowl. Frisco, it's going to be New York City by the time some of these bowl games are over with the marketing campaign that's going on for Frisco, Texas. North Texas, we've talked about this before, right? Grabbing them as an underdog. This one is holding steady at plus 3. I think that's still a play for me, man. North Texas plus 3 against Miami of Ohio, with the quasi home game there for North Texas. And then finally on Thursday, the Gasparilla Bowl. I don't know what a Gasparilla is. It could be a lizard. It could be a plant. It could be a seasoning. I don't know what a Gasparilla necessarily is, or if it even is anything. But I do, and we've talked about this before, I do like UCF here. plus the 7 was available last time we sort of talked about this. Again, it is down to 6.5. I think this is an interesting game. I think they are alive to beat a Florida team that I don't understand, or I don't think will be particularly into this game come Thursday. I think it's a bigger game for Central Florida and Gus Malzahn than I do think that this is a relevant game in any way, shape, or form for a Florida team in flux here as they go through yet another coaching change. So we got 5 bowl games here in the next 3 days. We'll be back on Friday for the Friday bowl game, the Christmas special, the Christmas Eve special, the Hawaii Bowl, and everything that's going on after that.
I love it, my dude. Always giving us the picks, always blessing us with the leans, the angles, the information and education, as I always like to say. But of course, Mr. Russell, the people always want more. They're always going to ask more. No matter how much you give them, people are always going to want more. Right. So where can the people find you on social media to find out some more information that you might be handing out, maybe some college hoops picks or something like that? Where can the people find you online?
Yeah, and you said maybe some college hoops picks, because maybe there might be college hoops picks. Maybe there might be college hoops games out there, right? And at this point, right, they've wiped out a week's worth of NHL hockey. There might be some college hoops that get played. There might not be. We don't know at this point. We have a couple of interesting games here on the horizon, Xavier and Villanova. I want to mention this, a couple of different things here. Actually, first, before we get into that, I should mention last week's Gambit. You'll recall it was sort of a sleepy week. We're like, okay, there's a bunch of teams here that could be on upset alert and, you know, just sort of blindly betting 6 games. Those games went 3-3 against the spread, and it took us to the 6th and final game to get a money line winner with New Mexico State over Washington State, but we eventually got one as a big underdog. One of these smaller school programs more interested in a pre-holiday game with their bigger school brethren there. So all is well that sort of ended well from last week's standpoint. But I mentioned Xavier and Villanova. The Big East is handing out forfeits on these COVID games. And so if you're scrolling through your score, you'll see that like last night, there's a series of 2-0 finals in college basketball in the Big East because guys weren't, teams weren't able to play. And so they forfeit and the winning team gets 2 and the losing team gets 0 and it counts against their record. So will be interesting to see sort of what happens with that going forward as far as, loosening the protocols a little bit, or are we still going to keep this, crazy forfeiture thing going? All of that is to say Xavier and Villanova play. I have Villanova as an 8.5 point favorite in that game. Again, tread lightly out there with who may be in, who may be out, et cetera, et cetera. And then the other nice game, because unfortunately Louisville and Kentucky got canceled this week, which is brutal because that's obviously always a fun rivalry. Arizona and Tennessee, not necessarily a rivalry by any means. I don't know. I can't even remember the last 2 times these 2 teams played. Arizona is legit, but this game is at Tennessee. I have Tennessee about a 3-point favorite in this game, but would be leaning towards Tennessee in that game. But you mentioned the Twitter space. At MRussAuthentic is where you can find me on Twitter. Everything that I write for over at The Score gets retweeted through there. The NFL props are a really good example. Saturday afternoon, always 10 props for Sunday, and in this past case, Saturday night as well. Rocking and rolling with those, hitting 60% with 10 plays a week. I mean, you're getting 10 bets just to follow in the prop game. And by the way, they're also winning. Like, how fun is that? And of course, a bunch of primetime games this week. We'll have an assortment of props and best bets along those lines. Though, of course, you guys are privy to anything I do when it comes to against the spread type stuff here on the podcast.
Perfect as always, my dude. Looking forward to catching up down the line and, maybe a little Xmas vibe, some vibes for the next pod.
Can we go Christmas sweater? Can we go ugly Christmas sweater on Friday? Do you have one of those in your pocket? Can we get festive on Friday?
Actually, I do. That's funny. It's funny you mentioned that. I'll tell this. Yeah. Yes.
Boom. Festive Friday. Hey. Here we go. Love it. Okay. Hey. Thanks for having me, brother. What a great time. As always.
What a time. And if you want to follow me online, you can do so on Instagram at Sheldon Alexander and on Twitter at Shell Alexander. Like and subscribe to the DRF Sports Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And for more from this brand new project from DRF Sports, we just got to make sure. If you're not familiar with the letters DRF, Daily Racing Form has been around for over 100 years, giving you all of the horse racing information, data, and analysis. But now we're taking over the entire sports world. So if you want all the coverage on every football game, as well as the NBA, MLB, and more, head to drf.com/sports for all of the details and insights, as the site has all the data on every game, including offensive and defensive stats, betting angles, line movements, key injuries, and more. The DRF data is what powers our power trends. So if you want to see which trends our analysts have selected, follow us on Instagram and on Twitter. If you want access to all of the raw data, go to drf.com/sports. That's where you get the usual game previews. And of course, we go in depth on this podcast. Basically, however you want your betting information, we've got you covered. That's all I got for now. But remember to tune into this DRF Sports Podcast every Tuesday and Friday. And hey, sometimes if you're lucky, we sprinkle in a little extra episode here and there. But until next time, that's all I got for now. See ya.
Thanks for listening to the DRF Sports Podcast. Please subscribe, rate, and review the show. For more sports betting advice, go to drf.com/sports and follow on Twitter at @DRF_sports.